When I was in the 9th grade, I played softball. I loved it. I actually played all through high school. Even in those days, which was a while ago, if you were serious about a high school sport, you were encouraged to play almost year-round. So I played on a citywide team that summer, and on my team there were a couple of girls that were going to run cross-country for my same high school. And I don't know how, but they talked me into being on the cross-country team with them. With very little thought, I joined the team as I began 10th grade. I can honestly say it is one of the things I have done in my life that I would categorize as a failure. Elise, I would give anything to have had your ability. Up until that point, I was used to being in the category of people who did quite well. I could not run long distance for the life of me. I was strong, I was fast, but I had zero endurance and seemingly had no desire to build endurance in that arduous way. Now, if you had seen me at the very beginning of the race, like the first few hundred yards, or at the very end, the last few hundred yards, you would have been impressed with my speed. But after I started out so fast, I petered out and I had to walk a lot of the way. And then as I could see the finish line in sight, I would just give it everything I had and go across the finish line, usually in last place. What I learned from the coach early on, aside from the fact that cross country was probably not my jam, is that I did not know how to breathe. Every time I would run, I would get these terrible stitches in my sides. I took them as a sure sign that I wasn't supposed to be running long distances. The coach told me that it was actually something that I could learn to do differently that would help. It had never occurred to me before that moment in my life that breathing was something I had to learn. Though it took some time, I did eventually learn how to breathe while running, and I'm here to say it does make a difference to breathe properly as you run. And a long time after high school, I grew to enjoy running long distances. But I ended the cross-country season that year as one of the worst runners on the team, and I wisely made the decision not to return. We often take something invaluable from our trials, and running cross-country was a real trial for me. Learning how to breathe properly began during that cross-country season, though, and has continued throughout my life because I often hold my breath and am not even aware that I'm holding my breath, or I take very shallow breaths and never get a full breath. As we explore step 5 in inner spiritual meditation, may we be mindful in our breathing. We're going to look at the difficulties in being mindful, and we're going to look at the difficulties in paying attention to our breathing so that we can grow in both. I want to set breathing aside, though, and dive right into mindfulness. How many of you have heard the term mindfulness? Everybody, right? So a broad dictionary definition is this: the quality or state of being conscious or aware of something. Another dictionary definition, which goes a little deeper, is this: a mental state achieved by focusing one's awareness on the present moment while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations, used as a therapeutic technique. Well, beyond dictionary definitions, Ed Bastian, who wrote the book on inner spiritual meditation, He connects mindfulness to meditation, saying, mindfulness is actually a general term for a broad category of helpful mental attributes that are especially important for cultivating a sustainable and satisfying practice of meditation. I think if I were asked for a definition, I would say something like this. Mindfulness is being fully present in any given moment in body, soul, and spirit to what is right before you. In our 7 steps, mindfulness is a critical tool that we need in order to develop a meditation practice. And breathing is a tool that increases our mindfulness, which then improves our meditation practice. So let's do a brief mindfulness quiz for ourselves. When you are talking with another person, how often are you able to completely clear your mind and body of all distractions and listen to each word the person is saying as though you are really only hearing one word at a time? When you are sitting and praying, or maybe you're walking and praying, how often are you able to clear your mind and body of distractions and stay completely focused on the prayer? When you're out in nature, say you go for a walk, how often are you able to clear your mind and body of all distractions and be with each bird that you see or hear, be with each flower, each tree, each dog or person that you meet, or patch of sand or grass that comes your way or is right in front of you? If you answered not very well to any or each of those questions, take a moment to consider what it is that gets in your way. What are the things that tend to distract you when you're trying to be fully present and have a difficult time? So when you're listening, or when you're praying, or when you're really out for a walk and just want to receive and see and be with what's in front of you, what is it that distracts you? What are the things that are competing for your attention? I will confess that in addition to having trouble with breathing, I also have trouble with mindfulness. I am a person who likes to think ahead. I am often thinking ahead. It's one of the things that makes me a good pastor. It's also one of the things that makes it difficult for me to stay fully present in any given moment. My mind works so quickly, and I'm often trying to remember things and trying to anticipate things. Sound familiar? Even in church, even as we're in worship, I'm often thinking about the next piece that's coming. So what really is the harm in that? In his book on inner spiritual meditation, Dr. Ed Bastian recalls his experience of learning meditation. He began his learning with the Dalai Lama, who then connected him to 2 teachers with whom he worked extensively in India. He recounts in the book that the most important lesson he took away from his experience with learning meditation, aside from actually the discipline of meditation, was the teaching he received about what was called the mental spy. This was a process he was taught in order to observe the inner workings of his mind. The mental spy is a part of our consciousness that observes the other parts and keeps us aware of the background noise and the multitasking and the constant fluctuations of our mind. He writes, as our capacity to observe becomes more and more refined, we can even see the most subtle interactions between sensations, emotions, conceptualizations, words, and actions. We realize how our words and interactions with others are being controlled by the unconscious inner workings of our minds. When we shine the light of awareness on all this background noise, it often subsides without further effort on our part. Gradually, our mental spy refines its capacities for observation until nothing escapes its grasp. He goes on to explain that after meditating for many years, he learned to observe how the mind is constantly multitasking beneath our conscious awareness. He describes our mind as a river that carries currents of thought, memory, emotion, sensation, habit, addiction, perception, and concept, and all at the same time. It's a lot that is constantly going on in our minds. Now, before I go further, I do want to say that the concept of the mental spy that he's talking about here is not an inner critic. The mental spy is not a critic. The mental spy is more like the mirror or the light shining on all the processes. So if you have an inner critic voice that is particularly strong, this is not that. This is simply a tool for gaining an awareness. Our state of mind is always influenced and controlled by these currents in our mind that are not visible but present. And it's our lack of awareness of these that can be harmful. The hope with this fifth step is that with meditation, we can begin to become more aware of our various states of consciousness and then channel our consciousness in positive directions. To give a concrete example of this, I want to share with you one of the things that we were taught in my coaching training. Because coaching begins with the affirmation that each person is creative, resourceful, and whole, a coach's job is to facilitate each person's ability to access these in themselves. In other words, a coach is not supposed to be giving advice or steering someone in a particular direction. So one of the tools that a coach learns to avoid this trap is called self-management. Self-management means recognizing when thoughts, feelings, judgments, and projections arise in oneself. I can have an entire internal dialogue with myself about someone or about what they should do. But if I'm managing myself in this time with the person, then they're not ever going to hear or experience any of what's going on inside of me. If I'm noticing it and letting it move on, then I'm able to refocus on being fully present. I was in a coaching situation with someone who is queer and is serving a church that just voted to close its doors. Well, I am also queer, and I served a church from 2003 to 2006 that ended up voting to close its doors. A lot of similarities there. And you cannot imagine how many thoughts and feelings I had and how many warnings and boundaries and protections I wanted to tell her to put into place. By managing myself, by managing my own inner voices and my own great ideas, I was able to be present to what she needed in that moment. She didn't ever hear any of my great ideas, because that's not what she needed in that moment. If I weren't aware of all of that stuff, you can just imagine how much of it I would bring into a coaching session. Most of us do this on a daily basis as we listen to friends, family members, coworkers, other students, and people we just meet. We say the things that to us seem smart or justice-minded or anti-racist or in some way that will establish our credentials, or we launch into our own story because something they said reminded us of something. Or in some cases, we carry with us an annoyance or an irritation or some sadness, and we carry that into the conversation or interaction without even knowing it. Sometimes we know why we do those things, and sometimes we don't. Our lack of awareness of all of our own influences is an outcome of a lack of mindfulness. So let's come now back around to breathing and mindfulness, since this step is about being mindful in our breathing. Breathing is one of the necessities in life because we cannot live without oxygen. If you've ever struggled to breathe, you know the fear that comes with that. Any of you who suffer from asthma have likely known that fear and struggle. Or if you've ever fallen really hard and had the breath knocked out of you, you know that fear and struggle. Or if you have heart or lung issues, you know it. Even swallowing the wrong way can make you struggle to breathe for 5 minutes. I had a heart procedure in February that I was awake for, and as they pumped adrenaline into my body to make my heart race, I struggled to breathe. I had a mask on because we had to wear masks because of COVID, and I had to keep the mask on during the whole procedure. So my heart was beating faster than I could keep up with in terms of breathing. And what happened in those 3 hours or more was that I had to be singularly focused on my breathing. If my mind started to wander or if I started to feel afraid, I simply had to return to my breathing and try to listen for it. It might have been meditative, if not for all of the sounds and sensations going on in the operating room. I was motivated to keep breathing, not just to stay alive, but so that they could complete the procedure. If I had not been able to keep up, or if I'd said it was too much for me, they would have stopped and the procedure would have ended. So breathing was my contribution to the whole effort. Breathing is what got me through that whole terrible experience. Spiritual traditions around the world teach that breathing is one of the keys to health and happiness. Even secular practitioners use breathing as a way to increase health and a way to decrease stress and pain. For all of us who live in a city, we sometimes notice that when we go outside of the city, when we go into nature, all of a sudden our racing hearts begin to slow down a little, and our shallow breathing becomes a little fuller, and we notice that our nervous systems begin to let go a little bit. While there's nothing inherently spiritual about breathing, we do have in our Christian tradition biblical references to breath and spirit and wind, which are sometimes used interchangeably. Most of us believe the Spirit of God, or what we call the Holy Spirit, is a breath force within us that guides us to wisdom and leads us in the ways of wholeness and community and service. In one of the creation accounts in Genesis, God makes an earth creature out of the clay and then breathes life into the creature who becomes human. In Ezekiel, it's God who breathes life into the valley of dry bones. So we have images of God's breath being what gives life and breath to humans. Learning how to breathe when we are born, or when we're running cross-country, or even when we're in distress, or even when we're nervous, is critical and necessary. And then learning how to breathe into mindfulness is a big step in our spiritual lives. Learning how to connect our breath with the breath of the Spirit is an even deeper step. Maybe this is what Jesus was doing when he continually withdrew to quiet places to pray. In an opinion piece in the New York Times today titled, "I didn't want it to be true, but the medium really is the message," Ezra Klein reflects on the internet and technology and how they impact our attention. While he does a historical look at what warnings have been issued over time regarding television as entertainment, news shows, reality TV, and more recently, various forms of social media, he winds the article down to the punchline. Twitter, for example, with its 280-character limit, is a mold for getting people to accept ideas without context. It's a mold for getting us to want constant awareness of what other people are discussing. It's a mold for getting people to care less about the quality of a conversation than they do about the amount of response generated. So to get 5,000 responses is far more important than the tenor or the level of the conversation. And we get hooked on the numbers. Toward the end of his piece, Klein quotes from a book by visual artist Jenny Odell titled, "How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy." Odell suggests that any theory of social media must begin with a theory of attention. She writes, "One thing I have learned about attention is that certain forms of it are contagious. When you spend enough time with someone who pays close attention to something," and she writes, "If you were hanging out with me, it would be birds," you inevitably start to pay attention to some of the same things. I've also learned that patterns of attention, what we choose to notice and what we do not, are how we render reality for ourselves and thus have a direct bearing on what we feel is possible at any given time. These aspects, taken together, suggest to me the revolutionary potential of taking back our attention. So Klein's conclusion in the article asks these questions. Attention is contagious. What forms of it, as individuals and as a society, do we want to cultivate? What forms of attention do we want to cultivate? What kinds of mediums would that cultivation require? While he's discussing technology specifically, we can hear the questions through the lens of our spiritual lives. What forms of attention do we here want to cultivate and help spread through society? The 7 steps of inner spiritual meditation are a kind of attention, a medium, if you will, that we are trying to cultivate. How you learn to breathe and how you are mindful of your breathing is a form of attention. How we learn to become mindful in all situations is a form of attention. And learning how to meditate is certainly a form of attention. We can learn how to pay attention just like we can learn to run long distance or learn to breathe properly. when we recognize that there are many mediums that are trying to mold us into people with very short attention spans, we have agency to be intentional about cultivating forms of attention that lead us to health and happiness, gratitude, transformation, love and compassion, and mindfulness. May it be so. Amen.